You are listening to another episode of the Orange and Black Insider Bangles podcast. Hello, everybody. I am Anthony Cosenza, joined as usual by John Sheeran. We take the air with heavy hearts, anger, frustration, sadness, a myriad of emotions, I think, that are hard to express in some ways and very easy to express in some others. We have a lot to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about what's kind of going on in the world. We're going to talk about what's going on in the United States right now. It may make some people uncomfortable, but I think that that's okay. Given what's going on, I think being uncomfortable in some ways is okay, because a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of what we're hearing is more than uncomfortable. It's frustrating. It's sad. And we couldn't really do a show without at least addressing some of our feelings and some of our perceptions of things going on. And we're not going to take the whole show to talk about it, but we will take a portion of the show to talk about that. We're going to talk a little bit about what Bengals players are doing in light of this social injustice and everything going on in the world. We're going to talk a little bit about the team, and we're going to talk about the 9-for-9 positional series. We're going to kind of transition out of that. John has been doing a great job with the 9-for-9 positional series, and we're going to continue that with some running backs talk, and we have an announcement at the end of the show. But as I said, John, bringing you in, good to have you in, buddy. This is one of the things that, and you can kind of probably hear my voice shaking a little bit because I've already got quite a bit of emotion here. You and I, everybody looks at this thing, in a way, and I think that we're all frustrated, we're all saddened, and we all want some change in a lot of different ways. I know you've probably got a lot to say. I've got some things on my mind too, but I'm going to let you have the floor a little bit, John. I know you've been pretty vocal on some of your platforms on some things, so if you've got some thoughts, I'd love to hear it. I know our listeners would love to hear it, and there's bound to be some feelings, but if you want to take the floor, my friend, it's all you.
I'm glad that it makes you uncomfortable. I'm glad that it makes any of our listeners who are uncomfortable, because at the end of the day, it's so goddamn simple. And that's why it's embarrassing to hear the words America and great in the same phrase. How does a country that so often boasts itself for being better than everybody else not take the appropriate matters in snuffing out systematic racism at all costs? It's fundamentally an issue of simply listening. And it should be the easiest step to take for people who look like me. But apparently it's not, because this stuff transcends more than just 4 years ago when Colin Kaepernick originally sat down on the bench and while the national anthem was playing, and then was given the advice of a Green Beret, Nate Boyer, to kneel during the national anthem to protest police brutality and the unjust killings and murderings of African Americans by the American police force. That's all it was. That's what they explained that it was numerous times, specifically in the first few months of said protest. The message of that has not changed. It still hasn't changed after 4 years since then, after countless more unjust murders of African Americans by the American police force. Yet, people such as Drew Brees today, and so many other people who claim themselves to be American, continue to ignore that simple message. And that's why the last week and a half, the last week of May, and now the early part of June of 2020 has unfolded in the way that it has. And the entire country bleeding, burning, and wondering how the hell did we get here? riots, lootings, massive cries of help. They are the voices of those who have yet to be heard, who have still are being unheard. And that's on us. It's on everybody. It's on the people who continue to willingly remain ignorant on very simple issues, on very simple requests, on very simple messages being spread by those who continue to be pressed by fellow American people. Racism is bad. Systematic racism needs to be stopped. The police force needs extreme reform at the very least. Maybe abolishment might be good. And the hypocrisy displayed by those who are in power and the kind that has remained in power for hundreds of years in this country is unquestionably laughable. A couple weeks ago, we saw protesters, mainly of the white demographic, take charge on government buildings in states that were being locked down by COVID-19, getting in the face of law enforcement who were trying to keep the peace, I guess, in those establishments, and getting really violent, really loud, really angry at said lockdowns because they couldn't get haircuts. Nobody was injured. Nobody was harmed. There wasn't any unjust police actions in those protests. 3 weeks later, George Floyd was murdered by a cop who pinned his neck down onto the pavement for 9 minutes. 3 others watched, and it was just the latest of events such as these. And then peaceful protests broke out throughout the country. And next thing you know, the entire American police force and National Guard is militarized in attempts to snuff out these very simple messages. It is the most damning example of white privilege that I think I've ever witnessed as a 23-year-old white American. White privilege is something that I've had the fortunate, happening of having, even in some instances where I don't realize that I have it. But white privilege is when you're afforded the chance to learn about racism instead of experiencing it in the most unfortunate circumstances. White privilege is for 400 years, people who don't look like the people who colonized this land have been playing from behind simply from the fact that they don't look like the people who colonized this land in the first place. Over 100 years of things being unequal in the form of slavery, about 100 years of things being inequitable in the form of segregation, and throughout all that time and to this day, things being unjust. Our issues will not be solved for good until justice is established. We're not going to get it from leadership that continues to incite suppressing outcries for justice. We're not going to get that now, and we're not going to get it until these protests and these outcries for help are heard on willingly listenful ears. And that, I think, is the most frustrating part, because maybe we're seeing progress now, but that only happens if, even after all this blows over, we maintain this energy and we maintain this fight and the strive for things being just in America, things where a country where it should be just, where everything that we stand for, it should apply for everybody, not just for people who have remained in power for over hundreds of years. This is a football podcast, and we get the pleasure of talking about football because in this country, football is something that it's a luxury that we have, but it's a luxury that we shouldn't be able to afford if we can't even figure out the simplest of basic human right fundamentals. If we are still tackling issues like this, even with a pandemic going on, we're in a lot worse shape than what we originally thought.
It saddens me greatly to see, obviously, what we've seen from the egregious murder, George Floyd, to the violence that has ensued since. Unfortunately, this is, and I think you touched on pieces of this, John, what we're kind of seeing now has been a powder keg that has been waiting to be lit. And it's a powder keg that is from previous filmed police brutality murders. It is from the peaceful protests we've seen from prominent athletes and whatnot that either were quelled, ignored. And then you mentioned the COVID crisis, where unfortunately a lot of people are out of work, they're angry, they're depressed, and financial hard times have hit them, and they're angry. And when they see what they saw, that anger spills over, and people have had enough. I will say this. There are a couple of people that, another couple of unfortunate, and there's been a few, another couple of African Americans who have lost their lives during these protests that have now become riotous. David Dorn, and you know, he's a former police officer himself, was shot and killed in St. Louis. African American man who served his community. You know, I think George Floyd being the catalyst, and you know, I do think as someone like David Dorn does deserve some recognition, and that is an unjust murder as well. There was a former University of Indiana football player, Chris Beatty. He was also shot and killed in some riotous activity. That's, the riotous activity, I understand it because of the anger and the frustration and all of that. But that saddens me, not only because of the violence, but, you know, community unrest, further uncertainty that goes with that. That saddens me, as well as the egregious death of George Floyd. So, I come at it, John, with some frustrations of my own, aside from the racism aspect. Obviously, I am vehemently against all forms of racism. I come at it also. Many of you have heard me talk about my sister on this program, and how many of you may know that she passed away. What you may not know is how she passed away. I've kept it private because my family likes to keep it private. My sister was murdered and was a victim of a murder. So when I guess there are things about my life where I say, yeah, you know, I don't understand certain plights that because of my background, but I do understand the plight of losing someone very dear to me from murder. And unfortunately, where I'm going with that is my family has experienced the frustration of the justice system and other failings within the U.S. there. So when we talk about social reform, when we talk about getting rid of some of these injustices, you know, that's something for me that specifically kind of comes to mind. And there have been wrongful arrests. There have been, obviously, the George Floyd killing, all of these things. My sister was killed almost 3 years ago, and the idiot who did it has still yet to even see a trial. That is how broken a lot of our systems are. And so I'm going off on a tangent, I guess, a little bit here, but I do have some experience in a violent crime, unfortunately. And that is where I can understand quite a bit of, at least from my background, my personal background, firsthand experience, some of the stuff that's going on. I don't like sharing that part of my life and what happened to my sister. I thank my co-host John, because he has donated to a cause that we set up. And you know, I guess where I'm going with it, John, is I'm just sick of people being terrible to each other, whether it's on social media, whether it's in these videos that we get fed that show police violence of the violence caused by these riots, etc. I'm just sick of it. And this year has sucked. 6 months in, 5 months in, this year has absolutely sucked. And you know, I guess my thing is, yeah, if you want certain changes made, keep pushing for them. I would implore that further violence and being terrible to each other, whether it's through social media, whether it's through other forms, whether it's in-person interactions, I would implore that maybe you think twice about that, because there's enough of that going on. And, I hope we can all agree on that front, that, I'm sick of the videos of, to be honest, I'm sick of the videos of people that are videoing things going on and not getting in people's way to do and say the right thing. They're videoing people fighting. They're videoing people, and instead of trying to quell a situation, and it's not just this past week or so. This is something that's prevalent upon social media. There are accounts where it shows they literally post videos of kids fighting in school, and it's getting to the point where it's very destructive. And especially when many people are at home because of job situations, etc., they see a lot of that, and there's anger, and it just breeds a lot of contempt and anger. And be a voice for what you want done. I would just implore that the violence and destruction, while I guess on some level is understandable because of the anger that stems from some of these situations, I would just implore that we just knock that off. It's just, there's enough hate, there's enough people going back and forth on social platforms and all kinds of stuff that focus in on what you were talking about, John, the changes that I think a lot of people want to see made and need to be made in a lot of different areas in this country.
There's something to be said about a perspective like yours, where you have experienced injustice, and somebody who's really close to you, obviously, that was the victim of it. And that perspective is something that a lot of other people share in this country who don't look like us, and they experience it at a higher frequency than for people who do look like us. And for people who don't have that experience, like myself, fortunately, the most important thing that we can do is just listen. It's listen, empathize, and understand. None of these riots and these lootings and this bloodshed that's happening is something that people want to do. It's not an act that they wake up wanting to do. That's not how they want to spend their day. They would be people in those situations would love nothing more than to experience the lives that people who don't look like them experience on a daily basis. And we're not going to get to a point where that's going to happen until we all understand and empathize where they are coming from, because we don't have their experiences. And I understand that I'm not the predominant voice in this matter, as someone who has never shared those experiences. But for somebody who's trying to understand and is trying to listen for the first time in their lives, because this is finally gaining the traction that it so gosh darningly deserves, this is how you do it. You listen, you empathize, and you understand what people are going through, and only then can any sort of progress be made with all of this.
Yeah. Well said. And I think that there's a lot more to unfold with what's been going on over the past 7-8 days. I'm hoping that what does unfold is maybe more of the peaceful protests, and maybe some of the reform is quickly going to be undertaken by those in positions of leadership and in other areas. But it's obviously been a very, very tumultuous year in many levels in 2020. And we as this little podcast, our two co-hosts, the people who view it, listen to it, we have to be people that try and make things better. That's kind of the bottom line. And some of the the vitriol and the hate. It's kind of all part of the, like I talked about, the powder keg thing. And I'm just kind of a little at a loss for words. My mind's been going in a lot of different directions, both on this specific topic and others that have been happening to me in my life and to those all around us. So I apologize if I'm not being as eloquent as I should be, but we had to talk about this. It's impossible not to, and it is the right thing to do to talk about it and talk about some of our feelings we have on it. The one thing I want to say, John, to transition a little bit in terms of the Bengals scope of things, I saw that the organization a little bit, and I've been kind of a little bit hit and miss on social media really over the past couple of weeks. One thing I saw, at least in recent light of this event, is the Bengals may be catching some heat for not maybe making a public statement in this regard. I will say this to defend them a little bit. This is an organization that was founded by Paul Brown, who was one of the innovators in the NFL to bring in African-American football players to the NFL. Mike Brown has shown a penchant to help certain football players and, all kinds of different stuff. So, they've kind of been a little bit on the cutting edge. Granted, it's been a little while. I don't know where you stand in terms of them maybe not making a public statement. Maybe they have really since this afternoon or this evening. But I think I give them a little bit of a benefit of a doubt in terms of not making a public statement because of some of their track records in this regard. But I don't know where you kind of stand on that.
Cincinnati Bengals Twitter account has not tweeted in the past 3 days. I believe Steven Ruiz of the Touchdown Wire at the USA Today's Football Network wrote an article and basically diagrammed every team's statement regarding everything that's happened. And only the Chicago Bears have come remotely close to even mentioning the aspect of police brutality. In my mind, if the Bengals say something, it's going to be something that's very similar to what every other team, aside from the Bears, has said, and aside from Ben and Jerry's, where they essentially put police brutality and white supremacy on blast, which is honestly what someone of this magnitude of influence should be doing. So for me, if the Bengals make a statement, fine. But I know it's not going to mean anything. It's not going to have any weight because ultimately it's the reason why there are people who listening to this podcast don't want us to talk about this is because we're a football podcast. They're a sports team. We're not supposed to have opinions on this matter. We're not supposed to express our opinions to people who don't want to hear them, who want to escape from the world that is boasting those opinions back at them. This is supposed to be an escape for them, but it's not. Because we're not robots, we're not drones. We don't only talk about football. We don't only think about football throughout our days. We have other external factors that affect us, and ultimately, I think that goes for the Bengals too. Maybe they would like to make a statement, but maybe they feel like they'll offend people if they do, and in a way that's cowardice. But also, it's just the standard for what organizations do in times like these. It's easy just to say that we stand against racism, we stand against police brutality, we stand against all these other things that logically every human being should be against, every ethically and morally upright standing citizen should be against. But it's another thing where your actions have to match your words. Like the Jaguars released a statement, and Shad Khan, the owner of the Jaguars, donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration, and has association with entities that support the inciting of this division that we're experiencing right now. The Bengals, if I distinctly remember, brought in Eric Reed for a visit, and then ultimately didn't sign him for reasons that had nothing to do with the fact that he was a decent football player. Like the 49ers put out their Blackout Tuesday one, but they got roasted alive because they blackballed Kaepernick, the guy who was on their team. So it doesn't matter that much to me because I know whatever they'll say won't have as much weight as it should. And if they did, it would surprise me. But ultimately, it's just not what I'm expecting from them.
Yeah, yeah, it is a little interesting that they've remained quiet. I've tried, like I said, to give them a little bit of a benefit of the doubt, given some of the other instances. It was a good reminder you brought up the Eric Reed situation. That was something that didn't readily cross my mind, but that is a good point. So unfortunately, this is it may be a little too late on their end and easy to criticize, I guess. But on the plus side, John, a lot of the Bengals players are doing a lot of and saying a lot of good things in light of this situation, and we want to highlight that. Name one is the newest quarterback, Joe Burrow. He posted a tweet that kind of got quite a lot of clout, and rightfully so, based on what he said in it. And I will put this up here in just a second. But basically what he wrote on May 29th was, "The Black community needs our help. They have been unheard far too long. Open your ears, listen, and speak. This isn't politics. This is human rights." And very well said here. I'll share that here in case anyone has not seen that. I think at this point they have. By the way, what you're going to see here, if you're watching us live, our good friend Ace Boogie, who's part of the Orange is the New Black podcast on our channels. You see, he's got a Terrell Owens, that's my quarterback, GIF going in the comments below it. But good stuff there from Joe Burrow. And then, of course, you have Auden Tate in his hometown of Tampa Bay, cleaning up the neighborhood there after the riots and certain unrest has hit that community. So kudos to him. Khalid Kareem came out with a very just a great statement. I'll try and find that to post as well. I guess why I'm bringing this up, these are the young players on this team, John. These are, Auden Tate's entering his third year. These two other guys are rookies. And you're seeing examples of leadership and quality individuals, but you're seeing it from the young players on this team.
That's the most important part, because these guys are my age and they've experienced all the injustices that I've experienced and that people of our generation have experienced, at least in the past 5 or so years, when it really hits, I think, who you are as a person, your character, the hardest, because, we were still developing as people during these times where things started getting more and more out of control, up to the boiling point that it's at right now. But these guys were touted as leaders in college. 6 of their 7 draft picks were team captains. All the guys who have made statements or have inputted their commentary on Twitter, they were team captains. And even T. Higgins did his part as well. All those guys were touted as leaders, but leadership in itself is not being a centrist. It's not saying that all sides have weight. It's not taking, it's not having this cowardly, nuanced type of worldview on issues where there is a clear right and there's a clear wrong. Leadership is having the courage to recognize what is right, what is wrong, and sticking your neck out there and having other people follow you and listen to you because of your conviction to tell the hard truth that needs to be told. And if the Bengals have a core, a base, a young foundation of guys who do get it and have a coaching staff who supports their willingness to be the leaders that they want to be, then going forward, this team will be a lot closer and a lot stronger than I think a lot of us ended up realizing. And it all starts from the top, obviously. Joe Burrow was the first person on the Bengals, at least in this draft class, to do something like this. And at the end of the day, that is who he is. That is who he's always been. He's never been shy away from issues like this. That's the person, that's the character that he is. And what he said in itself is not too groundbreaking. He said it is in politics, even though it is politics. What he meant to say wasn't an issue of partisan, which it is. Or it isn't in itself. It is an issue of politics at the end of the day because it is human rights. But That is who Joe Burrow is. That is who Logan Wilson is. That is who Khalid Kareem is. And if these guys realize that and realize what actually being a leader is, that bodes both the Bengals, whether you disagree with them or not.
I have up the quote from Khalid Kareem that he put on his Twitter. It's a longer one. I like what he said towards the end here, and he emphatically used single sentences or kind of spaced out sentences. Don't use this as a chance to better your brand. Use this as an opportunity to create change in this world. Protesting isn't the only way to be involved. You can donate to different causes that are put in place to create change. Be the change you want to see in the world. Obviously there's a lot more there, but very, very well said by him as well. And, this has been something that the Bengals have preached this coaching staff has preached in terms of bringing in certain people, bringing in players of a certain caliber and a certain background, team captains, right, John? Guys who, coaches kids and all kinds of stuff that specifically play to a locker room culture. And I think that, at the time, some people were saying, why not this player? Why not that player? But, when you evaluate players and you bring players on your team, I can speak a little bit from a coaching perspective. I coached, baseball for a little while. And, sometimes you keep or you bring in someone who may be perceived as maybe a little lesser talented, but that they are someone that is good for your locker room. They're someone that is, they just fit what you want. And yes, of course, they're talented enough and you can use them. But I think you understand what I'm saying in terms of building a culture and building the type of team that you want based on some of these character profiles.
And at the end of the day, like we applaud players who speak on issues like this, but it's not any different from just basic human logic and decency that everybody else who has good morals and ethics have displayed in history, and whether they're famous leaders or just average American citizens. People don't want athletes to have voices on some of these issues, primarily because they're afraid that their stances are going to be different from those who like to watch them smash into each other 60 times a game. But they're people like you and me, and they deserve the voice and they deserve the opportunity to utilize their platform to do the most good. And if this is how the Bengals are going to move forward, I could not be prouder to cover them and associate myself with them.
So some of the Bengals obviously speaking up and making some interesting statements in light of everything. And, we wanted to highlight some of the things that they're doing and saying. I was particularly impressed with Auden Tate and his just, hey, I'm going to go clean up my city. I thought that was very good, a very good gesture on his part. And, he also went on another prominent sports program to talk about his experience working with Joe Burrow and the team and the direction heading there. So, and he was very positive about all of that, which was good, obviously from a team perspective. But, it's good to see these guys, doing some things that in a time where there's not a lot of positive things going on, you can kind of look at some of these things and say, hey, that's well done. That's well done. Before we get to our 9 for 9, we usually save this a little bit for the end, but we want to, it's been a heavy first 2/3 of the episode here. Obviously getting some interesting comments in our chats, but that's fine. We kind of expected that, and I'm sure more will come. I look forward to the emails we'll be receiving over the next couple of weeks. But we have some good news and a little bit of a programming note. Next week, we'll be starting an hour early on our broadcast. Next Wednesday, we will be starting at 7:30 Eastern, because John and I will have the distinct pleasure of being joined by Ken Anderson, Bengals quarterback, should be Hall of Fame Bengals quarterback. former MVP, and we're excited to have him. He's been John, he kind of popped up out of nowhere on Twitter and got this kind of big following, rightfully so. And he's just kind of been he's kind of been a guy in quarantine who's been doing like his little happy hour sessions, I think. And I think maybe you got to speak with him this week with Hoji and Dario. No, you did not.
I unfortunately was not able to do that, but Dadio and Hoji conducted an interview with Grace, and if you want to check it out, it's on their YouTube channel, DNH Sports, and it should be uploaded to this podcast channel of audio files pretty shortly.
So yes, and obviously we're not going to overlap two very different shows, obviously, between their show and our show. But we're not going to overlap. But we are going to have, if you do happen to listen to both episodes or both shows, that's awesome. If you listen to one or the other, that's awesome too. Just listen to somebody. Just listen to one of us. But Ken Anderson will be joining us, and we are excited to kind of catch up with him, see what he's doing, and obviously hear about the Ken Anderson Alliance, his foundation. And as we've mentioned throughout the past couple of months, a lot of nonprofits are in need of support, given the fact that they haven't been able to do in-person fundraisers and all kinds of things. So anxious to catch up with him, get his perspective for his first time on the program. We're excited about that, and obviously to hear hear what he's doing with his foundation. So that will be next Wednesday. We'll be starting an hour early at 7:30 p.m. because we want to accommodate Ken's schedule, and we're excited to have him.
So I guess we can go to the easy portion of the show and just talk about meaningless, stupid football. We're going to talk about running backs tonight, as I think the 5th edition of our 5 for 5 series, 9 for 9 series, where we overview the Bengals 84-man active roster currently, one that is all but 100% numbered. I believe DJ Reader is the lone player who does not have an official number attached to him, but all 7 running backs on the roster do, and we're going to talk about basically all 7 of them, because odds are most of them, probably 4, will make the active roster, make the final 53-man roster. Maybe one of them gets stashed on the practice squad in itself, but I suppose the conversation starts with the guy up front, and Joe Mixon. 2 straight years of 1,000 yards rushing, 2 straight years of seasons that were basically tales of 2 seasons, where he just basically caught fire towards the end of both seasons as the blocking in front of him progressed or changed or altered. Regardless, Joe Mixon's entering his 4th year. He's entering a contract year, a year where he's probably going to get a multi-year extension before the start of his 4th year, before he even gets the chance to enter free agency. We can talk. We have talked about the logistics of a decision like that in itself, but I think we can assume that that's going to happen, and we can also assume that it's going to be business as usual for him and the rest of the running backs, where it's him leading the way with touches, carries, snaps. They have to justify that contract that they're going to give him in some capacity. And the best way is to feature him as a number 1 running back. And again, whether that's smart or not, it's a debate in itself. But Anthony, with Giovanni Bernard still on the roster behind Joe Mixon, and with the hopeful return of Rodney Anderson and Travion Williams, how much more do you think of a rotation is this backfield going to be? And by rotation, I specifically mean the more distinct differentiation of roles with some of these guys, whereas it probably shouldn't be and won't be Joe Mixon taking 20 carries a game when the team is fully healthy and doing good.
Well, so I'm pulling up some stats for people to look at here. The interesting thing to note with Joe Mixon is the touches. There was a time not too long ago where, running backs in terms of rushing attempts would get well into the 300s for a season. Mixon came close to that last year. Played in all 16 games. So that's largely the reason why there was a jump in overall touches, as well as just they kind of fed him the ball at the end of his rookie year. So when people kind of talk, that's the one thing I kind of look at a little bit and say, when we're talking about the contract extension, a possible contract extension, there is a little bit of, or it's not, this isn't a guy for 3 straight seasons has had, 300 plus carries and, a lot of different touches in the receiving game. He's up there, especially last year. So that kind of, for me, plays a little bit into what the pro Mixon contract extension type of situation. To your other question, I'm very intrigued as to what the roles for Travion Williams and Rodney Anderson will be this year. I think if Rodney Anderson is healthy, if you see, what we saw in preseason, he can play. He can play. And if he's healthy, when he's healthy, he can play. He can do a lot of things. He is another multi-dimensional back, and he fits the system they want to run in the running game. So, I'm very interested in that. And I think also we didn't mention him, and it's going to be interesting to see how his role plays out. Samaje Perine was also brought back. I don't know that he's going to be a roster make based on Williams and Anderson and all these other guys, but I guess, when the Bengals brought him back, John, he was supposedly a very tough cut for this team. One of the last guys that they, did not want to get rid of. So very deep group, arguably the deepest on the team. I think we know what to expect out of Mixon, and I think we'll only see better once the offensive line shores up.
Perine is an interesting case in the fact that he's an uninteresting player. And you're right, though, because the Bengals were on record for saying that they loved having him in the locker room and they wanted to keep him for as long as possible. And when they finally did waive him, they didn't like doing that. And I think they meant that with some resemblance of earnest and honesty. At the end of the day, I think you can make the argument he's the 7th most talented running back on this roster right now. And I'm looking at the biggest wild card here, and it's Jacques Patrick, who played in the XFL and went to school at Florida State. He's technically just a first-year player because he was a rookie who didn't end up doing anything in the NFL. He didn't end up going to the NFL. He went to the XFL first, and he signed a 3-year contract with the team, albeit no guaranteed money, minimal salary in itself. But Jacques Patrick, I think, has the chance to bump. No, not necessarily make the roster unless they were to go 5, but he is an interesting talent, and I think basically makes Perine just forgettable in every sense of the word when you're talking about the rest of this position group. Devil Whaley, the running back from Arkansas, probably has more of an interesting skill set to look for other than Perine. But Patrick, how he does in preseason, I think is going to be interesting because he's going to get a lot of reps behind the top 4. And the rest of the top 4 being healthy is the biggest test of the Bengals and how they handled the Mixon situation. Whereas last year, this position got decimated by injuries. It's the only reason why Samaje Perine was on the roster last year, because Rodney Anderson retore his ACL, Travion Williams wasn't healthy, Joe Mixon suffered injuries the first week or two in the regular season. They just had barely any bodies. But the reason that they weren't successful early on in the season wasn't because they didn't have any running backs. That was far from the only and most important reason. But I think they were so stricken by that lack of just unfortunate string of injuries that they loaded the position group now with talent there, and they're prioritizing keeping Mixon in the fold because he's been the one guy, aside from Bernard, who has maintained his health and maintained his effectiveness. But I think if Anderson and Williams stay healthy throughout the preseason, they make the roster, they show that they're talented. If they already paid Mixon at that point, and they can't just deny themselves from utilizing the talents of Anderson and Williams, they're going to put themselves in a bind and make themselves look like hypocrites, saying, why do we pay Mixon all this money when we have multiple guys behind him who can produce very similar and give you comparable and marginal effectiveness at that position? If they stay healthy, it can potentially make them look really, really bad, really stupid based on what they do with Mixon in the offseason.
Do you feel that, because this there was a question in the live chat that prompted this. I think it was from Frank Randolph in the Facebook chat. If they use Mixon like, it's not a question, it was more of a statement, I guess. But if they use Joe Mixon like McCaffrey, his numbers would be similar. Do you feel? I mean, I guess, do you feel that that's accurate? I feel like it could be somewhat accurate. I think McCaffrey is obviously a better receiving back from Mixon, but I do think Mixon's receiving ability is underrated. But do you think that if a contract, I think of a contract is forthcoming,
Yes.
just to the chagrin of some, whatever, or the delight of others, I don't know. But I think a contract is coming for Joe Mixon. Do you think that would prompt the Bengals to say, okay, with this contract, now comes an even a higher increase of workload, and then you see a lower profile of Gio and these other guys we're talking about? Or is it status quo? We're going to give you about 250 rushes, another 40, 50 catches, and we're going to cycle these other guys in there. I think that's the wise move, especially for longevity purposes and effectiveness, but I don't know if the money means, hey, you're the guy.
Well, for starters, the McCaffrey point, it's not a matter of if he's able to produce like McCaffrey if given the opportunity. What's the value of having Christian McCaffrey and someone who produces like that for your offense? Christian McCaffrey was so dominant last year that the Panthers were a bottom 10 offense. That probably didn't go the way that most people expected it to go. Mm-hmm. Christian McCaffrey was so good at being so minimal in the success or the lack of success in the Carolina Panthers offense that the Panthers gave him $16 million a year and over $30 million worth of guaranteed money. Why they did that, I have no idea. But I do know that if you have a guy like Christian McCaffrey who can produce like Christian McCaffrey, it doesn't really do your offense that much good compared to just having a really good quarterback. And that's the main factor in this. If the Bengals passing offense remains healthy and effective with Joe Burrow, with AJ Green and the other receiving options, there's no need to give Joe Mixon 15 to 20 carries a game. There's no need to put the offense all on him like they had to do for the past 2 years in the final half of the last 2 years, when you saw Mixon's numbers increase, when you saw his effectiveness increase, when you saw his missed tackles and yards after contact all increase. They had to do that with Mixon because they had no passing offense. Their passing offense was in the bottom of the league last year. And at times in 2018, it struggled as well. And they just had to put it all in Mixon because they had no other option. And obviously, they didn't have the blocking consistently to do it effectively all year. But time and time again, in the late 2010s and now entering the 2020s, if the best option in your offense is a multi-purpose back who can run and catch, your offense is not going to hold up against the other actual good offenses in the NFL. You're not going to be able to compete on a weekly basis. You're not going to be able to compete when it matters against really good teams, because most of the really good teams, if not all the really good teams, can beat you with your passing offense. The value of running backs who can catch the ball is so far down the list compared to receivers and tight ends and basically any other pass catcher. Well, actually, it's really the only two. But regardless, the value of running backs who can catch the ball is devalued. The value of a rush compared to a pass is devalued. The value of a guy like Christian McCaffrey, it doesn't exceed the value of any other basically skill position player that impacts an offense. So unfortunately, whether or not Joe Mixon can be Christian McCaffrey is all but irrelevant.
Do you feel that the Bengals offense will how high of a, based on kind of what you've all said right there, how big of a role do you think running backs will play in the receiving game? We know Joe Burrow liked to use Clyde Edwards-Helaire quite a bit, especially towards the end in that effective run of big games. He was not only like a nice little dump-off option, but Edwards-Helaire ran some very effective routes. He would split out from the backfield. He would do all kinds of different stuff. I think these backs can do quite a bit of the same and have shown that they can do quite a bit of the same. I guess, do you see that happening? Do you see more multi-back sets with a Joe and a Gio out there? Or is that just getting a little too wacky too soon?
Well, when you have two running backs on the field, you're taking away another skill position player. If you feel like it's better to have two running backs out there compared to maybe your one tight end, then by all means go for it. If you feel like you have the scheme and the type of plays and the packages that can best utilize that personnel grouping, then go for it. But it's all about maximizing your personnel. It's all about utilizing them to the best of their abilities. If you have Joe Mixon, Giovanni Bernard out there on the field at the same time, making minimal impact and doing nothing, it devalues the rest of your offense. We have someone in the comments saying, watch the Rams offense go from on fire with Todd Gurley and then scoring 3 points in the Super Bowl and he got hurt. If you remember correctly from that season, it was CJ Anderson who was actually the more effective running back in the offense as the year progressed and Gurley got hurt. And CJ Anderson was actually producing at a similar, if not better rate than Todd Gurley and keeping that offense afloat for when they needed to use him. And it's the biggest point in terms of running backs just being replaceable. If you can run the ball effectively, like the Ravens can do, there is still value in rushing the ball, even though it doesn't exceed the value of passing the ball on average. But the running backs themselves are replaceable, and I think that's the biggest truth that the Bengals have to realize, because they set themselves up perfectly to move on in a life without Joe Mixon, because they have guys like Rodney Anderson, Trevion Williams, and if they want to utilize these guys on the field at the same time and kind of keep the defense guessing in terms of who gets the ball, who's pass protecting, who's going out wide to catch screen passes, who's actually getting the balls on these draws, that's fine. That's a way to progress your offense and the way to supplement the main factor of what makes your offense go, and that's the Joe Burrow passing game. But if you just want to run the ball with Joe Mixon 25 times a game, don't expect to win more than 7 games.
Yeah, there's and we'll get out of here in just a couple minutes, but I feel like this is a good conversation here, John, because I feel like this position group is just like really exciting. There's a lot of good players in this position group and a lot of potential in this position group. Someone mentioned it. I unfortunately I didn't go back to see exactly who it was, but basically they made the notion that the offensive line started to play better at the end of the year. That was also the case in 2018 when Joe Mixon went on a run and put together, I think, in 3 of the last 4 games, he had like 100-yard rushing games, etc. So I guess I feel like we've had this conversation quite a bit, but now that we know, for the most part, the Bengals may make another move along the waiver wire or a post final cut type of waiver wire move. But I mean, for the most part, we know what they're going with on the offensive line. They brought in Hakeem Adeniji. They get Jonah Williams back. I mean, I guess we have to ask now again, post free agency, post draft, and as we talk about the running backs, I mean, where's your confidence level in terms of the backs having success on the ground with this group that they have in front of them?
I think it's moderate. Ultimately, their success will be dependent primarily upon the effectiveness of the offensive line. If the offensive line does remain healthy, I think it will progress to a point where these running backs can at least survive. It won't be at the dire levels of what we saw Joe Mixon have to go through last year. And I give Joe Mixon credit for suffering through that and striving above that as the season went on. Unfortunately, the offense just wasn't very effective when he was at his best, because that's just the nature of the game at this point. But I do think that the offensive line has at least improved at least somewhat with how things are supposed to progress with the guys that are developing there. Joe Mixon at this point is talented enough to work behind basically any offensive line and produce at the very least a moderate level compared to the rest of the league. His talent, I think, is unquestioned. And if you were to rank him compared to every other player on the Bengals, he would probably be in your top 5 most talented. And that's also something to watch for on CincyJungle.com. But yeah, I think the 4 that we're expecting them to keep, just Mixon, Bernard, Anderson, and Williams, that they will make up one of the best running back groups in the NFL. They are all talented. They all have, I think, different skill sets from each other. Maybe you have Mixon and Anderson complement each other in terms of similar skill sets, as well as Bernard and Williams in that same facet. But if they all remain healthy, they can all be utilized pretty equally throughout the game and give each other some rest. But ultimately, it comes back to they're going to pay Mixon a lot of money, and they're going to try to feature Mixon as the head of this group, and they're going to keep Anderson and Williams as your key depth guys to Mixon and Bernard in case something bad happens to either of them. But it will be like what we expected to see last year, where it was those 4 guys with Mixon and Bernard at the top. And if the offensive line is as at least decent as we can hope it is, they will be fine throughout the season.
Just total side note, Aaron Scott in the Facebook chat said, "Are you paying attention, Anthony? LOL," because I was looking around. I think we had like a little earthquake here just now.
What?
Yeah, so my house was rocking here. So I saw my TV wobbling and some other stuff. Very mellow, but that's
that's LA.
I'm about 90% sure that's what just occurred. I'll probably have to check the news wire to see unless I'm hallucinating. So I did space out for a brief second because I was like, what is this? But I did obviously catch everything you were saying there, John. One last kind of thing, I guess, unless I feel like I'm hijacking your topic here and I don't want to do that. But
this is our topic. I just happen to be leading it.
I know, but this is your brainchild, and I love this segment. You had somebody was talking about, it was Sixer Alex in the YouTube saying Burrow is another running back. Remember, and I'm not going there with this, but I guess I want to go to the point of, do you think that there's going to be a more heavy reliance on the running game a little bit early in the season because of limited practices, limited on-field sessions, rookie quarterback, still an inexperienced and or new faces on the offensive line that still need to gel? Is that all something that they say we're going to try and alleviate a little bit of the stress here for Joe Burrow? Or is that just an old school mindset that says we drafted this kid for a reason, we're going to let him wing it and run the offense?
It could be both. It is an old school mindset, the fact that you have to have a running game to set up a passing game, but it also could be what they will still intend to do. They might just have more trust early on in Joe Mixon just running the ball a lot and trying to, not put it all on Joe Burrow, when in reality, that's just not the case for quarterbacks anymore, or they don't have to have 7-step drops and take 5 seconds in the pocket to examine, 3 reads. They can make it easy for Joe Burrow in the passing game without having to rely on a running game that may or may not be successful early on in the season. Right now, they may have more confidence in that aspect of the offense because it does entail with more experienced players leading it. But I think Joe Burrow struggling is something that we all kind of have to accept early on in his rookie year, and basically maybe throughout his entire rookie year, because if you look at the history of rookie quarterbacks, specifically in the past 16 years or so, even after the boom of passion efficiency with the pass interference rules, not a lot of rookie quarterbacks are very successful compared to the average level of success for the NFL that season. It's the expectation that Joe Burrow probably doesn't experience much success in his rookie year, and I think the Bengals should probably realize that. But at the same time, they can't just not allow him to make the mistakes that he will inevitably make. If it damns them to like a 6-10 or 7-9 season, so be it. Just grow with that. Like, just because you pay Joe Mixon all that money doesn't mean you have to give him 20, 25 carries a game and limit what your offense can be, and limit the experience, the much needed experience that Joe Burrow has to eventually grow into a good quarterback that we all think that he can be. So maybe they do handcuff him in the first couple weeks because of this unorthodox offense, but it's not necessarily going to make their offense better if they do it.
So I guess we should end it with who you think, makes the team on the position group. Is that, and how many they keep?
Yeah. The 4 that were supposed to make it last year, I think, are still the 4 that make it this year. You have Mixon, Bernard, Anderson, Williams, and then your practice squad spot probably comes down to Patrick or Devwell Whaley, the guy from Arkansas. I'm not entirely sure if Samaje Perine has any practice squad eligibility left, considering now he's a 4th-year player. Yeah, so he just seems like the odd man out, despite how much they may like him. Maybe Williams gets bumped by Patrick. I don't know. I haven't really seen that much of Jacques Patrick play, but I know he's big and fast. Devwell Whaley, I guess, is the wildest of wild cards in this scenario, because he's the undrafted rookie who just always, like, there's always one in preseason that ends up making a little bit of noise or whatnot, but it's such a stacked position group, and I just don't see any monumental changes or any earth-shattering movements here.
Yep. I am in agreement with you about the 4 that make the team. Obviously, one of them is going to have to, show some stuff on special teams. That's usually how that goes. And you mentioned the other 2. That's what preseason. I mean, who knows what preseason is going to look like right now? But that's what preseason is usually for. Those guys get a lot of touches, so we're going to see a lot of those guys if preseason plays out the way that it usually does, those guys are going to get a lot of touches and get opportunities to make the team, make the practice squad, that sort of thing. And a lot of times those guys kind of ball out, and the Bengals have had the fortune of having other guys that were undrafted. Remember Terrell Watson a few years ago? He was a guy who played very well. James Wilder Jr. was a guy. So, I mean, they have these running backs that have a lot of skills that, slip through the draft cracks, and, they were able to scoop them up, and sometimes they hang on to the team, get some playing time going forward. But good stuff, John. I appreciate you continuing this. So we've done running backs, we've done wide receivers, we've done defensive line,
offensive line, and linebackers in that reverse order.
Yeah, there you go. I probably went backwards with that, but good stuff. That was the running back position in our 9-for-9 positional breakdown. I think we're going to get on out of here. I haven't said this. Usually I say it 2 or 3 times in the show, but this is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. If you're new to the program, you can get it on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, Megaphone, iHeartRadio. You can get it on YouTube. You can get it on cincyjungle.com, however you like to listen to your podcasts. We appreciate the support. And, subscribe to our channel so you can get notified as to when we go live, when new material is available. And like I said, just a reminder in case you missed it earlier, programming note, we're going to start an hour earlier than we usually do on our weekly show because we have, so at 7:30 Eastern, we have Kenny Anderson, former Bengals quarterback, should be Hall of Fame quarterback, joining us on the program next week. So we're pretty excited about that. The other thing, I'm sure we'll hear some feedback regardless this week, but we did ask before some of this other stuff had been occurring. We did ask about some feedback on more of a, not necessarily an everyday show, but maybe some shows that are more bite-sized, and especially with potentially training camp picking up and kind of some more movement within the NFL season. So if we have some fan and listener interest in that, we would be willing to maybe do a little bit more. Again, not absolutely every day, but maybe something that are a little bit more bite-sized episodes as compared to this. Obviously have our standard weekly show. So if that's something of interest, or if you think, hey, the weekly show is enough, that's good enough for us, and there's other shows on the podcast platform, that's fine too. We're just kind of gauging, and we're always looking to be better. So, that's let us know. I just want to say that to our listeners, we love you all. We respect you all. Thank you for keeping it. I would say about 95% of you in the live chat were very, very civil. And I would say almost all of you, actually, pretty much all of you were civil throughout the conversation. And we appreciate that. We appreciate you letting us, talk a little bit about some feelings about things going on. And, I just hope we have some more positive things to talk about in the coming days, because these first few months of this year have been very, very rough. And I just appreciate our listeners, and I definitely want to say that. And we appreciate the support you've shown this program. John, I appreciate you, your words, your wisdom, your contributions to the show, not only today, but for the past year and a half you've been on this show. You've been an awesome asset to this show. So I appreciate you. And, I hope everyone out there stays well. And, I'm not very eloquent today, unfortunately.
It's okay.
But that's kind of what I got.
It's more than okay. Like I told Anthony before we started the show, I would not feel comfortable doing tonight's show if we didn't address the things that we did address. I would not feel okay with myself not talking about things that should be talked about if we have even the smallest of platforms that we do have compared to the other platforms that other people have been utilizing. And like I said in the onset of the show, if it makes you uncomfortable, good. The worst thing that you can do with that discomfort is do nothing. The bare minimum of what I would ask everybody to do is to utilize that discomfort into channeling it into an avenue that you haven't done before. Listening, empathizing, understanding. That those are the steps at the bare minimum that people who haven't had the unfortunate concerns about what people end up going through in this country, if that's you, if you have the privilege of never experiencing the injustices that continue to happen after 400 years of the history of this land, I would just encourage you to, for once, for the first time in your life, understand the messages that are being expressed, take it to heart, and do everything in your power to utilize that discomfort into what you're hearing into more of a positive impact and worldview of the country that you live in. Maybe then will we end up seeing actual meaningful progress into what we all like to think is a great nation.
I just want to say this. I mentioned the situation with my sister earlier, and that wasn't easy for me to share. I don't, as I mentioned, I don't like to share details about it. I prefer to share the positives about her life and her memory and the foundation we set up in her honor. And I didn't want that to come off any certain type of way that may be misconstrued. I just kind of said, I just kind of wanted to say that there's at least a point. I just thank people for listening. And, again, I'm not very eloquent today, unfortunately, but, I didn't want to share details on that on this program because that's not what this is about. But I just, some things strike a chord, and that's, I appreciate people listening to that. I hope I don't really have to talk about that much anymore. But anyway, try just be good to each other. And we thank you for your support of this program. Thank you, John. We'll see you next time. We'll see you next week with Ken Anderson. So join us for that. And we thank you for your support. We'll see you next episode. I'll see you later, John.